So thank you guys for tuning in to listen to me talk about the time I spent chasing black rails in coastal Texas during my research for my dissertation. So diving right into the bird, well, first I will give you a little overview of my talk. I'm going to talk today about the research I did for my dissertation, where I spent many months over the course of 4 years, which was 2015 to 2018, in the coastal marshes of Texas, seeking out black rails. And so those studies include a species distribution model, a home range study, and then a study where I incorporated yellow rails and looked at interspecific density relationships in the context of fire. So the black rail is the smallest member of Rallidae found in North America, and it inhabits coastal marshes and freshwater wetlands throughout the Americas. And they're about the size of a house sparrow, and they eat small invertebrates and seeds, and they move around almost exclusively on the ground, pretty much always staying hidden under dense vegetation. And they rarely fly, so most humans have never seen one, but they are pretty darn vocal, so a lot of people have at least heard them. There are 5 subspecies of black rails recognized, and 2 are found in North America. The California black rail is out west, and the eastern black rail is found east of the Rocky Mountains. So the species is pretty darn widespread, but highly localized, and they mainly occur in coastal regions. But there are 2 notable inland populations of eastern black rails, one in Colorado and the other in Kansas. Nearly all populations of eastern black rails are thought to have declined dramatically during the past century, and they're listed as threatened or endangered in at least 18 states and as endangered by the IUCN. And then, as most of you probably know, just this past October, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service listed the species as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. And the Texas population has not been studied nearly enough, but they were somewhat recently added to the state list as threatened. The birds are considered a rare migrant in the eastern third of Texas and rare to locally uncommon residents on the upper and central coasts. And this, for the most part, coincides with what's been reported on eBird. However, there are numerous records in the Panhandle region of the state and some along the lower coast of Texas as well. Black rail habitat generally contains dense herbaceous vegetation, and the marshes can be fresh, brackish, or salt. From the human perspective, the vegetation seems to be extremely dense and it's nearly impenetrable, but the ground is a totally different scene. So the habitat from the perspective of a small ground-dwelling bird consists of clumps of fine stem plants that they can squeeze in between, or what I like to call railroads, and either moist ground or up to a few centimeters of standing water. But basically, if you just find the densest marsh grass you can imagine, along with the highest possible concentration of mosquitoes, plus the presence of rattlesnakes, you should be able to find a black rail in coastal Texas. So this is supposed to be a video where you can see and hear what a black rail generally looks like in the wild. However, it doesn't seem to be working. So I took a video just standing on the side of the road at San Bernard Wildlife Refuge. It sounds like the bird is 2 feet from me, but you definitely cannot see him. So lots of sea oxeye daisy and spartina grass in this bird's territory. So I studied the spatial ecology and habitat requirements of black rails in marshes of the Texas Gulf Coast from 2015 to 2018, with the objective of evaluating the factors that influence their distribution at multiple spatial scales. So let's get into the species distribution model. So the basis of a species distribution, that's what I meant to say, is habitat selection. And there are many factors that can influence habitat selection, but just to name a few, there are habitat cues, such as habitat structure and food resources, population density, or whether or not an area is at carrying capacity, and then intra and intraspecific interactions with competitors as well as with predators. So habitat selection is really a dynamic process, and the resulting patterns of distribution can vary. One way to try and estimate a species distribution is to model it, and SDMs combine species occurrence data with environmental data to make predictions of habitat suitability and where a species is most likely to occur. There are many different methods available to create an SDM, but basically you need to select the environmental parameters that are most likely affecting the species in question, and then you need the species data. So not all species data is created equal, and there are 4 types that can be used, and I list them here from lowest quality to highest. And there are a number of issues that can be associated with those first 3 types, but using occupancy detection data actually takes care of each of these issues and also allows for the estimation of the probability of detecting a species, which is important because rarely are individual animals detected 100% of the time, and estimates of cryptic species, like the black rail, tend to be biased low. So false negative detection errors can occur during surveys due to something like the wind hindering the observer's ability to hear a calling bird, or perhaps birds are present during a survey but just don't vocalize. And then to a lesser extent, false positive detection errors can occur. And this is usually from observer misidentification, or even something like a mockingbird imitating black rail, which they actually can do perfectly. So by accounting for imperfect detection, you can obtain less biased estimates of occupancy. So my objective for this study was to examine the drivers of black rail distribution at the landscape level of the Texas coast and create a species distribution model to map the probability of occurrence. So for the first 2 years of this project, my co-pilot was James Tulliver, who was working on his master's thesis at Texas State University. And the 2 of us, along with the crew of amazing field techs and volunteers, conducted over 3,000 call playback surveys at 6 sites along the Texas coast. And so here's a typical site map that shows our transects and point count locations. So each of these points was surveyed up to 6 times each year, and this is what allowed for the calculation of the detection probability. I started off with these 8 environmental parameters that I thought may influence black rail occupancy. So vegetation type came from the ecological mapping system of Texas, and then precipitation, existing vegetation cover gets at canopy density, marsh type, which is fresh, brackish, or salt, a couple of soil attributes, and then percent emergent wetland and distance to open water. So I had to finagle some of the layers a bit in order to use them in the modeling procedure. For that vegetation layer, there are 398 different map types, but based on the proportion of vegetation types we surveyed and the black rail detections within each type, I ended up parsing out just 3 individual vegetation types to use for the analysis, and then I grouped the rest together as all other vegetation types. I did a similar process with the existing vegetation cover, or EVC, and this represents the vertically projected percent cover of the live canopy layer. So I converted it to a continuous scale, and then I grouped all tree and shrub categories together. For the occupancy detection models, I used the same survey data that James used for his thesis analysis. So I included the same detection covariates, which were wind and lunar phase. James found that black rail detection was greatest under low wind conditions, closer to a full moon. And then for the occupancy covariates, I first fit occupancy models for each candidate covariate individually in order to weed out the uninformative ones. And then I fit 31 multi-season occupancy models with increasing complexity and used AICC model selection to compare the models. Finally, I evaluated the predictive performance of the top model using the receiver operating characteristic and the area under the curve technique, or the ROC-AUC. So this analysis basically tells you how well your model classified presence and absence. And to do that, I fit a logistic regression model to a training data set and then assessed it by applying the model to an evaluation data set. Survey results. So we detected the most black rails in Anahuac, which was 141, and this is over the 2 years. And then detections gradually decreased as we moved west, and we detected no black rails at Powderhorn Ranch. And 5 of those occupancy covariates were determined to be influential, and the yellow numbers indicate the sum weights for each covariate across all models, and thus the relative importance of each. And then the model selection procedure found the top model to be vegetation type, existing vegetation cover, and precipitation. And so here are the regression coefficients of that top model. So occupancy was influenced positively by precipitation, existing vegetation cover, and by each individual vegetation type, and then negatively influenced by all other veg types. And was also reported by James. The detection was negatively influenced by wind speed and positively influenced by lunar phase. So the combination of covariates with the highest predicted occupancy, which was about 87%, was the veg type of salty prairie, plus an annual average precipitation between 140 and 145 centimeters, plus 70 to 80% herbaceous cover. So basically that's the magical formula to get an 87% occupancy with my data. And then the AUC of the ROC was 0.67, indicating that the model correctly discriminated between black rail presence and absence 67% of the time. So it was considered between good and satisfactory. And then these maps show the combination of EVC and veg type with their associated occupancy estimates. I wasn't able to include precipitation in the maps, and I will talk about that in a minute. But so only about 6% of the study area had an occupancy rate greater than 20%, and that's represented by the blue, pink, and gold. So let's discuss. There was a positive association between black rail presence and dense herbaceous cover, which makes sense since the species is known for always staying hidden in the dense vegetation. For instance, of those 285 black rails that we detected during call playback surveys, only 2 were ever actually seen. And it may be kind of hard to tell just from this picture how dense the vegetation is. So there I am for scale. The highest occupancy rates were seen in the salty prairie and the second highest in the salt and brackish high tidal marsh. And both of these vegetation types can be dominated by Spartina spartanae, also known as Gulf cordgrass, and sometimes to the exclusion of other plant species. So Gulf cordgrass is a bunch grass with very narrow leaf blades that are super pointy as well. And they become intertwined with neighboring bunches, and they can create this dense canopy of overhead cover. And the other 2 previous black rail studies in Texas also reported a positive relationship between cordgrass and black rail occupancy. And then black rail occurrence was also positively correlated with annual precipitation, with the highest occupancy rates being in areas with over 120 centimeters annually, which occurs in the eastern part of the state. And this coincides with our survey results and also what's seen on eBird. So lots of detections in the east, and they gradually decrease as you move southwest along the coast. So one of the limitations of this study was not having surveyed the full range of precipitation values across the Texas coast. And because of this, including precipitation in the map actually constrained the predictions to just the area that included the precipitation values I did survey. So while there are predictions of suitable habitat in the southwestern reaches of the coast, the lower precipitation in the region may actually limit the species occurrence here. And then similarly, about 26% of the study area contained vegetation types that we did not survey and hence contain no occupancy predictions. If you look closely, you can see through the light yellow, there's some gray, because those are missing pixels, they're just empty pixels right there. So the predictive ability of the model was borderline good, but in any habitat modeling procedure, misclassification of suitable versus unsuitable habitat is inevitable. And this can just be due to problems inherent in the modeling procedure itself, or due to raster misclassifications, or just from excluding important occupancy covariates. And sometimes it's not really a choice to include things because the spatial data you may want just do not exist. However, visual assessment of the maps showed that most black rail detections were in areas with a greater than 40% occupancy, and many of the detections that were situated in lower probability areas were just less than 100 meters away from areas with higher occupancy rates. So conclusions from this study: the highest predicted occupancy was in high marsh habitats containing high levels of herbaceous cover, especially Gulf cordgrass. And I found a positive association between black rail occurrence and average precipitation, indicating that black rail distribution in coastal Texas may be limited by rainfall, at least in part. And then a very small proportion of the study area was predicted to have occupancy above 20%, which really exemplifies the need to protect the habitat that contains the known black rail populations in the state. So that concludes that study. So let's move on to the home range study. Okay. So part of determining if a population will persist in an area requires understanding where the species is, the habitat variables they require for success, and then also how much area each individual requires for their home range size. And home range can be defined as that area traversed by the individual in its normal activities of food gathering, mating, and caring for young. My objectives for this study were to determine average home range size of black rails in coastal Texas and examine habitat selection within the home ranges. So for this part of the project, I captured black rails over 2 winter/early spring seasons. That was 2017 to 2018. And conducted a radio telemetry study at San Bernard National Wildlife Refuge, which is just south of the Houston area. We use 2 different capture methods. The bottle line or drag rope method consists of going out at night and dragging a length of rope that's weighted with cans of rocks and small jingle bells and things through the habitat to cause a disturbance and hopefully flush the birds that are on the ground. So usually they would pop up and fly a short distance and then land, and then we would run up and gently place a dip net over them. But then once nesting season began, we had to be more mindful of nesting birds and avoid trampling any nests. So we switched to a call playback lure method, or what I like to call rail whispering. For this, we would go out after dark and play calls on our phones or small speakers until a bird responded. And then we would slowly approach that bird and continue to play calls until it basically would get fed up and then show itself, on which we would attempt to capture it. And we also actually tried incorporating a decoy kind of late in the game. And this may have worked once. After taking measurements and banding each captured bird, I would attach a 0.9 gram radio transmitter with Loctite epoxy gel directly to the bird's back. And I would hold that transmitter in place for 5 magical minutes and then place the bird in this extremely sophisticated observation chamber for another 5 minutes. And then before releasing each bird, I would check to make sure the wings were free from the glue and then it was good to go. Radio tracking began the following day, and birds were tracked up to 4 times a day at varying times in order to cover the entire daily activity period. And then locations were obtained at least an hour apart in order to avoid temporal autocorrelation. I calculated home range using 2 types of estimators, kernel density estimation and minimum convex polygon. So KDE is a statistical technique that predicts where an animal occurred but was not observed. And the resulting home range map shows the intensity of use of the home range. And then MCP is the simplest estimator. It just calculates a convex polygon for either all or just a certain percentage of the relocation data. KDE is more robust, but the MCP method is more widely used, so I calculated that as well in order to compare my results to other studies. And then to determine the minimum number of relocations necessary to reliably estimate home range, I created these observation area curves for a subset of the birds that were monitored for more than 10 days. So to do that, I calculated home ranges for each bird with an increasing number of randomly chosen relocation points until an asymptote was reached from sampling saturation. And so the curve showed that home range did not ostensibly increase after 20 to 25 relocations. Finally, to examine habitat selection, I extracted raster data from within home ranges using GIS, and I used that same vegetation layer from the previous study, the SDM study. I then used the aggressive-cool adjusted confidence interval method to determine preference or avoidance of vegetation types. And I also used data from a digital elevation model that was created for San Bernard from LiDAR data. So I tracked a total of 16 birds over the 2 years and obtained an average of 22 relocations per bird. The transmitter stayed attached from 3 to 34 days with 10.5 as the average. To be in accordance with the observation area curves, I analyzed home ranges for birds with at least 24 relocations, but that brought my sample size to 4 males. So for sake of comparison to other studies who did not utilize the observation area curves, I also analyzed home ranges for those of at least 10 relocations, which consisted of 13 birds, 9 males and 4 females. The average MCP home range size for that 13 bird sample was about half a hectare. However, I feel it is likely that the sample of the 4 birds with at least 24 relocations is probably a more accurate representation of home range size. And so the MCP for those guys was about 1 hectare. And then the maps I show here include an outlier bird that I actually excluded from all home range estimates just in order to mitigate data skew. So here's a close-up of the MCP map. And so that humongous home range in light purple was for a bird that we called Jamie. And his home range size was over 6 hectares. And that's compared to the second largest, which is the one on the bottom right in that reddish orange, and that was just over 1 hectare. So this bird, Jamie, we tracked him for 12 days, and on one of those days, he did something kind of interesting. He actually wandered about 415 meters in the span of a couple hours. And he later went back to his original area, but then he shifted his core usage area a bit, and then suddenly just disappeared. So that was all kind of weird. No other bird did stuff like that during the study. However, that same wandering activity was seen during winter and post-nesting in Arizona. And then you may have noticed the 2 sets of overlapping polygons. So those represented males and females that we captured together, and we assume were mated pairs. And an exciting thing happened with these 2 birds. So this is Kiki and Forky's territory. Forky was named after how many keys were in his call. So Kiki and Forky fell in love and made a nest, and they laid an egg. And I found this nest 10 days into tracking the birds. And the only reason I found it is because the male pulled off his transmitter and left it right next to the egg. So after I found this, I stayed away for a few days, but for some reason, the birds ended up abandoning their nest and their egg, and as well as this entire territory eventually. And so that's when I came back and took all the measurements. So there's actually very little data on black rail nesting in Texas, but to my knowledge, this is the earliest known nesting date for the species in the state, and actually for the entire subspecies. So the knowledge of this early nesting date is a pretty important finding for Texas, since many marshes are managed with prescribed burning. And then here are just some more shots of the nest location and the habitat it was in. So birds selected the salty prairie, salt and brackish high tidal marsh, and the back earth shrubland, and they avoided the low tidal marsh. So here you can see the percent of each vegetation type within home ranges versus the amount available in the greater area around the home ranges. So as you can see, there wasn't a whole lot of salty prairie available, it's just 9.8%, but black rail selected it within home ranges in the highest proportion. And the low tidal marsh had the next largest proportion within home ranges, and it made up the majority of the available area, but the birds were avoiding it. And then mean elevation within home ranges was 67 centimeters, and there was an average elevational change or gradient within home ranges of about 53 centimeters. So let's discuss. There have only been 3 other black rail home range studies, and California black rail populations are located in small pockets of wetlands, and so they tend to have smaller home ranges. The only other eastern black rail home range study was conducted in Florida during breeding, and the home ranges were found to be just a tad bit larger than those of my Texas birds during the winter. And studies of other members of Fallowday have found seasonal variation in home range size. However, non-breeding home ranges were larger than breeding, so the opposite of what we're seeing here. So if indeed the home ranges in Texas are smaller than those in Florida, it could indicate resource stability within Texas home ranges during the winter, or perhaps it's a function of regional habitat differences, or could just be due to density-dependent factors such as population size and intraspecific competition. So salty prairie wins again. It was the most common vegetation type within home ranges at over 50%, and the birds showed preference for this veg type. And roughly 40% of the remaining vegetation types within home ranges was split almost evenly between the salt and brackish high tidal marsh, which the birds preferred, and the low tidal marsh, which they avoided. However, I do believe that the low marsh is likely still important since water levels fluctuate a lot according to rain and drought. And so if the high marsh dries out too much, the birds can easily walk on over to the low marsh since it's very close. And then home ranges contain about 10% Baccharis shrubland, which describes areas that have been invaded by woody species such as eastern Baccharis, which is the shrub you see in this picture here mixed in with the cordgrass, and a couple other woody species. And so there were scattered Baccharis shrubs in most home ranges and areas of dense Baccharis bordering some of the home ranges, but no tracked birds were ever located within overtly woody areas. And so there may just have been some misclassifications in the raster data. And then the elevation within home ranges varied by roughly 1/2 meter. And an elevational gradient is not readily apparent on the landscape, and so it likely just represents a gentle slope or the inclusion of small pimple mounds. And so this gradient may be an important feature that would allow the birds to easily walk to higher ground during periods of high water. So overall conclusions, black rails seem to love habitats dominated by Gulf cordgrass. High marsh is better than low marsh, and an elevational gradient may be an important feature within home ranges. Also, very little is known on territoriality of the black rail, and it has been described as confusing, but it is possible that black rails in Texas are territorial during the winter, since the neighboring birds kept their individual territories. They also seem to try to defend them with their responses to call playback. I also learned that black rails are very difficult to capture and that radio transmitters usually fall off way too soon. Nesting can begin as early as March 19th, and rattlesnakes hang out above the ground in the vegetation matrix. And I actually learned that twice. And most importantly, dead birds on the side of the road might be a booby trap set by rattlesnakes, so inspect them with caution. And then final conclusion is that if you spend enough time somewhere, Google Earth will find you. That brings us to the final chapter. I usually refer to it as the yellow rail black rail burn plot study. So fire is a natural and essential part of Gulf Coast marsh ecology, and many coastal marshes are managed through a combination of fall or winter burning, herbicide application, and structural marsh management. And there are numerous purposes for burning the marsh that just depend on management goals. Some common goals are to limit the encroachment of woody or dominant plant species, improve habitat structure for wildlife, or to just alter the distribution of open water. At San Bernard National Wildlife Refuge, management's main goal with their use of fire is to maintain or recover grass-dominated ecosystems. So as you can imagine, the avian communities that inhabit these fire-dependent habitats are greatly influenced by the spatial and temporal heterogeneity that's created by fire. The yellow rail is often thought of as the second most secretive rail in North America. It's a tad bit larger than the black rail and consumes the same food items, and also behaves in a similar way, moving around on the ground under the cover of dense vegetation and rarely flying. And so the species is listed as a species of conservation concern in Canada, as well as by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Yellow rails winter along the Texas coast in the same areas as black rails, and when bottle lining for black rails in the winter, yellow rails are the most common bycatch, so it was an easy decision to incorporate them into the study to see if the two species respond similarly to the effects of fire. A few studies have looked at the effects of fire on these two rails. Eastern black rails in Kansas seem to prefer areas burned the previous year as long as cattle grazing and haying weren't occurring at the same time. However, direct mortality of at least 39 black rails was seen in Florida after a 90% burn of a marsh. And then for yellow rails, indirect mortality was seen in Texas, where birds fleeing burning marshes were depredated by raptors. And a few studies have looked at effects of fire on yellow rail occupancy, with the consensus being that they prefer recently burned areas on both breeding and winter grounds. And there are a couple of ways that fire may affect the habitat suitability for these rails, and perhaps the most important is changes in the herbaceous vegetation density, which these secretive marsh birds require to remain secretive. And then also the control of woody encroachment may indirectly affect these rails by changing the hydrology or impacting food resources or even altering the predator community. But the relationship between woody species and these rails is unclear. For instance, there's a population of California black rails that breeds along a creek in an oak ecosystem. And then yellow rail occupancy during winter was not influenced by woody cover, but the birds seem to avoid woody cover on their breeding grounds. So objectives for this study were to obtain and compare densities of black rails and yellow rails as a response to months post burn and habitat features, and compares the structure and study plots with different burn regimes. This study also took place at San Bernard National Wildlife Refuge, where we delineated 6 plots that differed in number of months since they were last burned. And so what we did was systematically bottle line each plot in attempts to capture black rails and yellow rails. And we aimed to sweep each of the plots 4 times a year, and we did this 2 winters in a row. So to give you a visual representation of what we did, here are the results from one of the plots for 2017. So each line represents a track where we walked, and the colors indicate different nights. And then you can see where we caught each bird. So ideally, we want to systematically cover the whole plot, sort of the way you would mow a lawn. But remember, this is at night, and it's on a refuge, so it's really dark. And we also have to avoid areas of dense woody shrubs. So we conducted habitat assessments in 50 by 50 meter areas around each location where a captured bird was flushed. And so we measured a number of different vegetation characteristics and also counted all of the red imported fire ant or rifa mounds within subplots. And those are meter sticks in those pictures. There's some monster mounds out there. So fire ants may directly affect birds by eating their eggs and killing chicks, but also indirectly by lowering populations of invertebrate species that might have been consumed by the birds. To see whether months post-burn was linearly related to habitat variables, I constructed linear mixed effects models where months post-burn was the fixed vector and burn plot was random and had an intercepts random effect. And then I also examined whether variation in habitat variables in response to months post-burn was greater among or within plots using the interclass correlation coefficient. And then finally, to examine black rail and yellow rail densities as a response to habitat variables and months post-burn, I used generalized linear mixed models where all habitat variables were fixed and burn plot was the random vector and had an intercepts random effect. And I used a Poisson distribution as the log length function. So I created 16 candidate models and used AICC model selection to compare them. Results. We conducted 84 bottle line surveys, 42 each year, and captured a total of 75 rails. In 2017, we captured 10 black rails and 46 yellow rails. So the plots are on the x-axis here with plot initials followed by months post-burn. We captured the most black rails in the 51 months post-burn plot, which is about 4 years post-burn, and the most yellow in the 15-month plot. However, I did want to point out we captured a pretty high number of yellow rails in the 76-month plot as well, which is about 6 years post-burn. And then in 2018, we captured 2 black rails and 17 yellow rails. And remember, these are the same plots just 12 months later. And both black rails were captured in the 27-month plot, and the most yellow rails were captured in the 23-month plot. So 2 plots actually burned in a wildfire 3 months before the season began, and subsequently no birds were captured in these plots. And we also captured no birds in the Cedar Lake Creek plot, which is where we captured the most black rails the previous year. Gulf cordgrass was the dominant plant species in each plot. Second dominance included sea oxide daisy, Eastern Paccharis, and salt marsh hay. There was a positive linear relationship between months post-burn and woody frequency, and woody frequency varied more among plots than within. And then herbaceous density also varied more among plots than within. However, it did not have a linear relationship with months post-burn. And then the density of fire ant mounds varied more within plots than among plots and had no relationship with months post-burn. So here are the results of the GLM model selection, and for brevity, I'm only showing the top few models for each species. So density of black rails was not explained well by any predictor. And then for yellow rails, the model featuring robel or herbaceous density best explained differences in the species density among plots where there was a negative relationship between yellow rails and herbaceous density. One final discussion. So there was no correlation between density of either rail species and months post-burn, and accordingly, it appears that both species will use habitats within a wide range of burn regimes. There was also no correlation between herbaceous density in plots and months post-burn, which may explain the lack of correlation between rail density and months post-burn. So here is the raw data showing the herbaceous density in each plot for both years. So notice how the 38-month plot is denser than the 76-month plot. Since fire intensity may have varied among burns, and fire really acts synergistically with nutrient availability and hydrology, it follows that the response of the plant communities to fire was not identical in each plot. There were no strong relationships between habitat features measured in burn plots and black rails. However, my sample size was pretty small, so it's possible the data just wasn't able to provide much insight. Also, I may not have measured an important attribute, for instance, food supply. And then plots with lower herbaceous density were more attractive to yellow rails, which actually agrees with previous studies on winter grounds. Some other noteworthy things, there was some plot use overlap between the two species, which could be due to habitat partitioning. So vegetation within plots was not homogeneous, and perhaps black rails stick to the more densely vegetated areas and the yellow rails to the less dense. And overall, I captured a lot more yellow rails than black rails, which may be due in part to differences in territoriality between the species. Yellow rails are known to be gregarious and non-territorial during the winter. So if black rails are territorial throughout winter, there would be less birds per unit area, and that would require a larger survey area in order to capture equal numbers. And there also may be a detectability difference between the two species. Yellow rails really seem to flush more readily, whereas black rails would sometimes pop up and then dive back down into the grass, never to be seen again. And then I detected a lot less birds in year 2, and there are a couple possible explanations for this. In between seasons, Hurricane Harvey hit the coast and caused substantial flooding on the refuge. And we were somewhat baffled as to why no birds were detected in year 2 in that Cedar Lake Creek burn plot, which is where the most black rails were captured in the first year. But as it turns out, that plot was flooded and had standing water for quite a long time. So we speculated that this could have caused the birds to move to higher ground and perhaps even affected the invertebrate community, and that could have kept the birds from returning to the plot. And then about 2 months later, there was a wildfire that burned 2 of the study plots. You can see the extent of the burn here. And then this is a picture of ground zero. Fire definitely affected capture rates in the 2 plots that burned. The Sargent East plot here burned, and I really got the impression that some of the black rails that were here just moved across the road for better habitat. But notice the difference in numbers between yellow rails or the plot that didn't burn. There's 16 versus 3. That one kind of remains a mystery. However, it did snow in between seasons soon after yellow rails would have arrived on the winter grounds. This is not normal for the area. Not sure if it had an effect, but thought it was worth mentioning. So overall conclusions from this study are that selecting an appropriate burn regime to manage for these species is really subjective, since growth rates vary among different areas. But despite the lack of correlation between months post-burn and bird density, there still seems to be minimum cover requirements for the rails. Black rails may need at least 27 months post-burn, and yellow rails at least 11 months post-burn, but this is of course depending on local vegetation growth rates. And then finally, these species may not prefer the same vegetative structure, so it's really important for managers to maintain a mosaic of cereal stages in order to support both of the species. And then to summarize everything, my studies provide information that is crucial for just beginning to understand black rail distribution in coastal Texas, as well as for managing habitat for the species. So the SDM hopefully sheds some light on areas of potential habitat and that could be targeted for surveying, perhaps find new populations. And the home range study helps us understand how much area these birds require and also what type of habitat they're using in coastal Texas. And then the burn plot study provides recommendations for how to manage for each rail species to ensure that they're able to persist and coexist on Texas refuges. So I just barely scratched the surface here, and there's still a lot of work to do. Long-term monitoring really needs to be put in place in order to understand how populations are doing and if their sources are sinks. And also, it would be great to have some genetic work to determine connectivity with the population and see how genetically robust they are. So this project was funded by the Texas Controller's Office, and a big thank you to my co-advisors at Texas State University, Clay Green and Butch Weckerly, who secured all the funding for these projects. Many thanks to my committee members and my amazing field techs that brave the mosquitoes and snakes with me every day and night. And a very, very special thank you goes to Jennifer Wilson and Woody Woodrow at U.S. Fish and Wildlife. They were my right-hand people at San Bernard and the most important members of my bottle line crew. Without their support and guidance and their unending enthusiasm, I don't think I would have captured a single bird, and I probably would have gotten lost in the marsh and succumbed to the mosquitoes. So that is it.